The Andes mountain range stretches more than 4,000 miles along the western edge of South America. In the central section, where Argentina and Chile share a long border, the terrain rises sharply from narrow valleys to peaks exceeding 20,000 feet. Glaciers cover much of the high ground. Snow persists year-round above 12,000 feet. Winds move constantly across the open slopes, carrying fine ice particles that reduce visibility and lower the effective temperature far below the recorded air reading. On the Argentine side of the Cordillera, near the Chilean frontier, lies a remote glacier field at approximately 11,700 feet elevation. The location is 45 miles east of the intended flight path between Mendoza, Argentina, and Santiago, Chile. No roads reach this elevation. No settlements exist within tens of miles. The nearest permanent human presence, small estancias or mining outposts, lies in lower valleys, separated by ridges and passes that remain snow-blocked for most of the year. In this sector of the Andes, the landscape consists of steep rock faces, ice fields, and narrow crevices. Snow accumulates in layers that can shift without warning under weight or vibration. Daytime temperatures in October hover near freezing. At night, they drop well below zero. Atmospheric pressure at this altitude contains roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. The thin air slows physical exertion and impairs clear thinking over extended periods. On the afternoon of October 13, 1972, the fuselage section of a Fairchild FH-227 aircraft came to rest on this glacier. The wings, tail, and much of the forward section had separated during descent. The remaining tube of aluminum lay tilted slightly, half buried in snow, surrounded by scattered debris and bodies. 33 people remained alive inside or near the wreckage immediately after the impact. The site sat in a wide bowl-shaped valley, flanked by ridges rising another 3,000 to 4,000 feet on all sides. From the air, the fuselage measured roughly the length of a city bus. Against the vast white and gray expanse, it appeared small. The surrounding silence was broken only by wind moving over ice and the occasional distant crack of shifting snow. The 45 people aboard Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 came mostly from Montevideo, Uruguay. 29 were young men associated with the Old Christians Club, a Catholic rugby team founded in the 1950s by alumni of the Christian Brothers Stella Maris College. The players ranged in age from 18 to 24. Many studied at the university or worked in family businesses. Rugby occupied their weekends. The team traveled often within Uruguay and occasionally to neighboring countries for matches. They were fit, accustomed to physical effort, and used to traveling together. On this trip, they chartered a military Fairchild FH-227 because commercial flights to Santiago were fully booked or too expensive for the group. The aircraft belonged to the Uruguayan Air Force, but was operated under civilian charter rules. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, had more than 5,000 hours of flight time. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagura, was less experienced on this type, but qualified. A mechanic and 3 flight attendants completed the crew. 16 passengers were family members or friends invited to join the excursion. Among them were the team's president, his wife, and their daughter. Several mothers and sisters traveled to watch the match and spend time in Chile. The group planned a brief stay in Santiago before returning home. The flight departed from Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo on October 12, 1972 at 2:18 p.m. It landed in Mendoza, Argentina, shortly after 5 p.m. because weather reports indicated poor conditions over the Andes. The passengers spent the night in a hotel in Mendoza. The next morning, they returned to the airport, boarded again, and took off at 12:55 p.m. on October 13. The route followed a standard airway across the Cordillera. The pilots filed a flight plan estimating 3 hours and 45 minutes to Pudahuel Airport in Santiago. At cruising altitude of 18,000 feet, the aircraft followed visual flight rules where possible, relying on ground landmarks because the Fairchild's navigation equipment was basic. Radio contact with air traffic control in Mendoza and Santiago was routine during the early stages. Inside the cabin, the mood was relaxed. The young men played cards, sang songs, and passed mate gourds. Some slept, others looked out at the mountains below. The aircraft carried limited supplies: sandwiches, chocolate, wine, and candy purchased in Mendoza for the journey. Luggage included rugby gear, clothing for a few days, and personal items. No one expected difficulty. The Andes crossing was a common route, flown regularly by military and civilian aircraft. As the Fairchild approached the Cordillera, the pilots requested clearance to climb to 20,000 feet to clear the peaks. Turbulence increased. Clouds obscured the terrain. The co-pilot, using dead reckoning and visual references, believed the aircraft had already passed Curico, a checkpoint on the Chilean side. In reality, the plane remained east of the main range, still over Argentine territory. The pilots turned west, descending through cloud to establish visual contact with the ground. They did not know the mountains ahead were higher than their current altitude. The passengers felt the aircraft bank and descend. Some looked out windows and saw snow-covered ridges close below. A few expressed concern. The team captain, Marcelo Perez, stood in the aisle to reassure them. The flight attendants roved through the cabin. No one panicked. The moment felt like ordinary turbulence on a mountain crossing. The aircraft descended through broken cloud at a speed of approximately 140 knots. The pilots, relying on visual references and an estimated position past the main divide, continued westward. Ground features appeared closer than anticipated. At 3:34 p.m. local time on October 13, 1972, the right wingtip contacted a ridgeline at roughly 11,700 feet. The contact was sudden and violent. The wing separated almost immediately, followed by the left wing and much of the tail assembly, and tore away the tail section. The fuselage continued forward, sliding down the glacier slope before coming to rest. 12 people died immediately or within minutes from trauma. The pilot, co-pilot, mechanic, 1 flight attendant, and 8 passengers, including several of the older family members. The remaining 33 survived the initial trauma with varying degrees of injury. Some walked away with bruises and cuts. Others suffered broken legs, concussions, spinal injuries, or compound fractures. Blood appeared on the snow outside the wreckage. Screams and moans rose briefly, then subsided into labored breathing and the sound of wind. Inside the fuselage, survivors pulled themselves from the wreckage. Those able to move dragged the injured toward the relative shelter of the broken tube. The cabin floor tilted at a shallow angle. Snow entered through the missing tail section and forward opening. Temperature hovered near freezing. The thin air made every movement feel heavier. No fire broke out. The fuel had spilled far behind during the wing separation. Within the first hour, the group took stock. They counted heads. They gathered what remained of food, clothing, and blankets. A small transistor radio was located among the debris. It received static but no clear signals. The fuselage offered the only protection from wind and snow. They packed snow into gaps to reduce drafts. Night fell quickly at that latitude and altitude. Darkness arrived by 6 p.m., bringing temperatures well below zero. Search aircraft from Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile began looking almost immediately following the filed flight plan. But the wreckage lay off the planned route, in a sector not yet overflown. The white fuselage blended with the surrounding snow and ice. From the air, at search altitudes, it appeared as little more than a shadow or irregularity on the glacier. No smoke rose. No signal fires were possible with the limited fuel and wet conditions. By the end of the first night, the survivors understood the scale of their isolation. The mountains blocked any view of lower valleys. No roads or trails existed nearby. The radio yielded only intermittent broadcasts confirming that the search was active but had not located them. After 10 days, official searches were scaled back and eventually suspended, based on the assumption that no one could have survived such conditions. The point of no return had passed in the moment of impact. The Andes held them now, and the distance to any form of help measured not in miles alone, but in vertical feet,
oxygen scarcity, and unrelenting cold.
The survivors organized the fuselage interior during the first full day. They positioned the less injured toward the rear, where the tube remained more intact. The forward section, crumpled and open, allowed snow to drift in. They blocked it partially with seats and luggage. The cabin floor, tilted slightly nose down, collected meltwater during brief sunny periods. They scooped this into containers, empty wine bottles, metal trays from the galley, and rationed it carefully. Food supplies totaled 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, some almonds, dates, candy, and several bottles of wine. They divided everything into daily portions measured by eye. Each person received 1 small square of chocolate or a few almonds per day, supplemented occasionally with a sip of wine for warmth and calories. The mechanic, who had survived the initial impact but died on the second night from injuries, left behind a small toolkit. This became central to their efforts. Roberto Canessa, a second-year medical student, assumed responsibility for the injured. He fashioned splints from seat frames and aluminum strips torn from the interior panels. Broken legs were immobilized as best as possible. He cleaned wounds with snow melt water and strips of clothing. No antibiotics existed. Infections set in quickly in the unsterile conditions. Pain was managed with the limited wine and by keeping the injured as still as possible. The cold dominated every action. Nighttime temperatures fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius or lower with wind chill. They huddled in groups of 4 or 5 beneath layers of clothing, blankets, and seat cushions. Body heat became the primary warmth source. They rotated positions so no one stayed on the outer edges too long. Frostbite appeared on toes and fingers within days. Blackened skin required careful monitoring to prevent gangrene. On the 8th day, October 21st, they heard aircraft engines overhead. Several planes passed close enough for the sound to carry clearly. The survivors rushed outside, waved clothing, and shouted, but the white fuselage blended with the glacier. No signal was spotted. The transistor radio captured fragments of news. Search efforts continued but focused on the Chilean side of the range. After 10 days, October 23rd, broadcasts reported that official searches had been called off. The realization settled quietly. External help would not arrive. With conventional food exhausted by the second week, the group faced starvation. Bodies of the deceased lay preserved in the snow outside the wreckage. Discussions began on the 9th or 10th day. Marcelo Perez, the team captain, led the conversations. He framed the matter in practical and ethical terms, drawing on their shared Catholic upbringing. Several compared the situation to the Eucharist, where the body provides sustenance. Not all agreed immediately. Some resisted for days. By the 3rd week, necessity prevailed. They began consuming small amounts from the bodies of those who had died earliest. The act was carried out methodically, away from the main group when possible, and only enough to sustain life. Urine was avoided as a water source due to its salt content. Snowmelt remained the primary liquid. An avalanche struck on the night of October 29th, day 17. Snow poured through the open tail section, burying 8 people alive inside the fuselage. 3 died immediately under the weight. Others were dug out over hours using hands and improvised tools. The snow compacted the interior, reducing usable space and blocking light. The group cleared a tunnel-like passage to the outside. 5 more succumbed in the following days from injuries sustained in the avalanche or from exhaustion. Daily routines settled into a pattern. Mornings began with melting snow over small fires, fueled by seat foam and paper when possible. They inventoried remaining strength and supplies. Canessa continued medical rounds, checking for worsening frostbite or infection. Afternoons were spent in small tasks, sewing insulation into sleeping bags from seat covers and electrical wire, reinforcing the fuselage walls against further snow load, or attempting to repair the radio. Evenings brought group discussions, practical plans for the future, recollections of home, or quiet prayer. 3 expeditions were mounted to seek help. The first, on October 29th, shortly before the avalanche, involved 3 men who climbed a nearby ridge but returned after 1 day due to altitude sickness and cold. A second attempt in early November covered more ground but found only higher peaks and returned weakened. Each effort consumed energy they could ill afford. Mental discipline held through repetition and structure. They maintained a calendar scratched into the fuselage wall, marking each sunrise. Birthdays were noted quietly. Marcelo Perez organized small talks to keep minds occupied. Nando Parrado, who had lost his mother and sister in the crash, withdrew at first, but later contributed to planning. Roberto Canessa emerged as a steady voice of pragmatism. The group enforced rules. No one ate alone, portions remained equal, and decisions required consensus where possible. By mid-November, bodies had thinned dramatically. Weight loss reached 30 to 40 pounds for most, muscle wasted, movement slowed. Yet routines persisted. They fashioned sunglasses from plastic to prevent snow blindness. They collected rainwater during rare thaws. They watched the sun trace a low arc across the southern sky, noting the gradual lengthening of days as spring approached in the southern hemisphere. In late November, Parrado proposed a final westward expedition. He argued that the Chilean side offered lower ground and potential human presence. The group agreed. They prepared 3 men, Parrado, Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin. Using insulation from the fuselage, they sewed sleeping bags and backpacks. A sleeping bag was tested by sleeping outside one night. It provided enough warmth to make the attempt feasible. On December 12, day 61, the 3 departed. They carried minimal food, small amounts of meat preserved from earlier, and the sleeping bag shared among them. The remaining 14 watched them climb the ridge until they disappeared from view. Inside the fuselage, the wait began again. Food stocks were nearly gone. They continued the same routines, now with fewer hands to share the labor. The days stretched. They listened for aircraft, though none came. They conserved strength, lying still for hours. The calendar reached day 72. After reaching a high point and confirming no immediate passage, he returned to the fuselage on December 15, leaving Parrado and Canessa to continue alone. The 2 men advanced westward and slightly north. They traversed glaciers, crossed crevices bridged by snow, and climbed successive ridges. Each day began before dawn. They roped themselves together with electrical wire when crossing exposed ice. The sleeping bag, shared at night, allowed them to rest in relative warmth. Food consisted of the last fragments of meat, rationed to sustain movement rather than satisfy hunger. Water came from snow held in their mouths until it melted. Altitude remained high, between 12 and 15,000 feet for the first week. Oxygen scarcity slowed their pace to a few hundred meters per hour. Wind and sun reflection burned exposed skin. They navigated by the sun's position and by sighting distant peaks they believed marked the Chilean side. No map existed. Their knowledge came from pre-crash geography and intuition. By December 19, after 10 days of travel, they had covered an estimated 38 miles, mostly uphill and then descending. They reached a point where the snow thinned and green patches appeared far below. Streams flowed in narrow valleys. On the afternoon of December 20th, they spotted 3 figures, Chilean gauchos herding cattle across a river. Parrado descended alone to make contact while Canessa waited. He approached the men, who initially mistook him for a mountaineer. Parrado explained their situation in a calm voice. A plane had crashed in the mountains. Survivors remained, and help was needed. The gauchos provided food, bread, cheese, and meat, and sent word by horseback to the nearest police post. On December 21st, a small rescue party reached Canessa. Parrado guided Chilean authorities back to the crash site by air. Helicopters arrived on December 22 and 23. The terrain prevented landing near the fuselage. The remaining 14 survivors were flown out in 2 stages after being carried by stretcher to a clearer area lower on the glacier. All 16 who lived through the ordeal were evacuated to hospitals in Santiago. Medical examinations confirmed severe malnutrition, frostbite, dehydration, and infections, but no immediate life-threatening conditions beyond what could be treated.